Chapter 1, The Dreamweavers. In the year 3025, the city of Oris stood at the center of the known universe. Towering spires of translucent crystal pierced the sky, and the air hummed with the hum of advanced technology and the promise of a utopian future. Yet beneath the surface of this gleaming civilization, there was a dark secret. A secret wrapped in the drug known only as Tramadol. Liora Vance, a young scientist, had spent years researching the effects of Tramadol. She was an expert in neurochemical engineering, and she had come to a troubling conclusion. The drug wasn't just a painkiller, it was far more. It was a tool, a key to unlocking the mind's deepest recesses, but it had an unintended consequence. People were disappearing. Liora sat in her laboratory on the 43rd floor of the Galena Research Tower, her fingers hovering over a console. She was staring at data streams, her eyes scanning for patterns she knew were there but couldn't quite see. The drug had begun to affect people in ways that no one had anticipated. It wasn't just a sedative, it was rewiring neural pathways, blurring the lines between reality and dreams. Those who used it for too long stopped waking up. Liora's thoughts were interrupted by the soft buzz of her comm. She looked up to see a holographic image of her colleague and closest friend, Zane Darrow, flicker to life before her. His face was tense, his eyes shadowed with a look of urgency. "I found something," Zane said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You need to come to the archive. Now." Liora stood immediately, gathering her things. The archive was a hidden wing of the Galena Tower, a place where only a select few were allowed access. Rumor had it that the archive housed ancient data about Tramadol, files that had been locked away for decades. If Zane had uncovered something, it could change everything. The archive was cold, its walls lined with sleek silver panels and glowing runes. Liora stepped inside, her boots clicking on the marble floor. Zane was waiting for her, standing before a large terminal, his fingers dancing across the holographic interface. "What did you find?" Liora asked, her voice steady, though her heart raced. She had been chasing answers for so long. Zane didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gestured for her to look at the screen. Data scrolled past in a blur, strings of numbers and symbols too fast for Liora to decipher. But then, in the middle of the sequence, one line caught her eye. A name. Project Dreamweaver. Her breath caught in her throat. What is this?" Zane exhaled sharply. "It's a government project, dating back to the early 21st century. I've cross-referenced it with the original research on Tramadol. They weren't just using it for pain relief. They were using it to induce dream states. But it wasn't just about the dreams." He paused as if weighing the words. Liora leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Zane's eyes were wide, as if he had stumbled onto a truth that had been buried for too long. They were trying to map the human consciousness, to enter people's dreams. But something went wrong. The drugs started merging the dream world with the real world. They began losing control. People didn't just dream, they lived their dreams. And some of them never woke up. Liora stared at the terminal in horror, her mind racing. Project Dreamweaver had to be a myth. It was a fragment of history that no one had ever fully understood, until now. "And you think this is happening again?" Liora asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Zane nodded grimly. "I'm certain of it. The same chemical pathways are being activated. People are vanishing, Liora. They're not dying. They're trapped in the dreams. And I think we can find a way to bring them back." Liora felt a shiver run down her spine. The implications of what Zane was saying were staggering. They had stumbled upon something far bigger than either of them had ever imagined. A drug that could trap souls within dreams. And if they couldn't figure out how to stop it, the entire population of Oris, and possibly beyond, could be at risk. "I need to see the original research," Liora said, a sense of urgency flooding her voice. "We need to understand how they were controlling it, how they were mapping the consciousness." Zane hesitated. "The research is locked behind the highest level of security. No one's gotten in for centuries. It's buried beneath the surface of Oris, in an old facility called the Nexus." Liora looked at him, her eyes burning with determination. "Then we'll go to the Nexus." Zane's face hardened. "It's not going to be that simple. There are people watching, people who don't want this information getting out." Liora knew he was right. But the truth was out there and it was calling to her. She was done running from it. "We'll find a way," she said, her voice fierce. And with that, the two of them set off on a path that would lead them into the heart of a nightmare woven from the fabric of dreams, where reality and illusion were no longer distinguishable. They had no idea what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 2, Into the Nexus. The city of Oris hummed beneath them as Liora and Zane descended into the depths of the Undercity. The elevator they rode in was old, its metal walls scratched and scarred by years of use. It groaned as it descended past the gleaming heights of the towers, carrying them deeper into the forgotten veins of the city. For years, the Nexus had been nothing more than a myth to most. It was rumored to be a hidden complex beneath the city, a place where the most dangerous experiments were conducted in secret. Experiments that the government and corporate conglomerates couldn't afford to let anyone know about. But Liora and Zane knew better. The Nexus was where the truth about Tramadol lay buried, and the answers they needed to save the people trapped in the dream state could only be found there. "Are you sure we can trust this?" Zane asked, his voice laced with caution as the elevator jolted to a stop. Liora didn't answer right away. She was staring at the doors, watching as the bright, neon city lights flickered beyond them. She felt the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on her chest. They were about to break into the most secure facility in all of Oris, one that had been sealed off for centuries. "There's no other choice," she said finally, turning to face him. "What we know about Tramadol so far is just the surface. We need to understand its origins. The Nexus is the key." Zane nodded, though his expression remained tense. The doors slid open with a sharp hiss, revealing a dark hallway ahead. As they stepped out of the elevator, Liora felt a chill in the air, colder than the sterile atmosphere of the high towers. It was as though the walls themselves knew they weren't meant to be here. The underground passage stretched on, its walls lined with rusted pipes and old machinery. There was an eerie quiet, as if the place had been abandoned for decades, if not centuries. "This place feels dead," Zane muttered. Liora glanced at him. "Maybe it is. But I think that's the way they wanted it. No one must know what happened down here." They moved cautiously through the shadows, their footsteps muffled on the ancient floor. The hum of hidden systems buzzed faintly in the background, and occasional bursts of cold air whispered from air vents above them. It was a stark contrast to the life-filled world they had just left behind. At the end of the hall, a massive steel door stood, unmarked and imposing. Liora approached it, feeling the familiar hum of a force field that ran through the doorway. It was a security measure designed to prevent unauthorized access, a feature Liora knew well from her time at Galena. But she had a few tricks up her sleeve. She pulled out a small device from her pocket, a keycard override chip, one that she had hacked from the archives during her last visit. Sliding it into the port beside the door, she typed in a sequence of codes. Zane shifted nervously behind her. "How do you know this will work?" Liora didn't look back. "I've spent years studying their security systems. This should bypass the codes. They won't even know we were here." With a soft whir and a faint green light, the door unlocked, sliding open to reveal a large, dimly lit chamber. The walls were lined with monitors, many of them flickering, their screens full of static. A few machines lay dormant in the corner, wires hanging loosely from their sides. But in the center of the room there was a large pod encased in glass. It looked almost like a cryogenic chamber, but Liora could sense something different about it. She stepped forward, a feeling of dread washing over her. "This is it. This is where they conducted the experiments." Zane came up beside her, peering into the glass. Inside there was a body, or what appeared to be a body. It was suspended in some sort of fluid, connected to a series of wires and tubes. The figure's face was obscured, but there was a faint pulse of light beneath the skin, an unsettling glow that made Liora's stomach churn. "What are they doing to them?" Zane asked, his voice full of horror. Liora swallowed, her eyes scanning the monitors nearby. Some of the data was too complex for her to read at first glance, but then one screen caught her attention, a series of neural scans. They showed brainwaves, not the usual patterns of thought but something far more erratic, almost like the brain was trying to escape itself. "Tramadol," Liora whispered. This wasn't just about manipulating pain. It was about creating a permanent connection between the mind and the dream realm. Zane's eyes widened. "You're saying these people, they're stuck?" Liora nodded slowly, her heart racing. "They're not just dreaming. They've been plugged into something, a system that doesn't let them wake up. They're trapped in a synthetic reality." She turned away from the pod, pacing as the implications settled into her mind. The government hadn't just been testing the limits of human consciousness with Tramadol, they had been playing with the very nature of existence itself. The people inside these pods weren't merely comatose. They had been siphoned into a dreamscape, one where their minds were endlessly processed and manipulated. "Liora, I'm not sure we can fix this," Zane said quietly. "We don't even know how this system works." "I know," she said, her voice hard. "But we have to try. We have to stop this before it spreads beyond the Nexus. I think they were planning to take it global. Before Zane could respond, there was a sudden noise behind them, a low, mechanical rumble followed by a blinding flash of light. Liora spun around, heart pounding, to see a new door slowly opening, revealing two armed figures in dark uniforms. The soldiers raised their weapons, their eyes scanning the room with cold precision. "No one's supposed to be here," one of them said, his voice amplified through a comlink. "Step away from the pod and surrender." Liora's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment when their search for answers had just become a fight for survival. She turned to Zane, her mind racing for an escape plan. They weren't leaving without the truth. "You ready?" she whispered. He nodded, and together they moved. The escape had just begun. Chapter 3, The Awakening. The sound of the soldiers' boots echoed through the chamber as they approached, their guns held steady, eyes cold with purpose. Liora's heart hammered in her chest, her mind racing for any way out. The soldiers were closing in, their movements precise and unhurried, like they had all the time in the world to deal with intruders. Zane's hand brushed against her arm, a signal. She glanced at him, and without needing words, they both knew what they had to do. There was no turning back now. Liora's fingers twitched as she activated a small device hidden in her palm, a smoke emitter. She pressed it discreetly against her coat and tapped a button. In an instant, a thick cloud of black smoke billowed around them, filling the room with an impenetrable fog. The soldiers cursed as the smoke surrounded them. Where did they go? Liora seized the moment. "Zane, move." They dashed toward the side of the room, running low to the ground as the smoke thickened, swallowing them in shadows. They couldn't let the soldiers trap them. The Nexus was a labyrinth of forgotten passages and hidden rooms, but Liora had studied the blueprints. She knew where the exits were, and one of them had to be close. Zane was already ahead of her, his silhouette barely visible in the dark. They passed rows of dormant machines, their glowing panels flickering erratically, almost as if they were watching them. "Liora, we need to get to the core systems," Zane hissed, his breath quick and shallow as they rounded a corner. "We can't leave without unlocking the main control hub. That's where the rest of the answers are." She nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure how they were going to break through a control center so well guarded. "I know. Keep moving." They moved swiftly, winding through narrow corridors, ducking beneath low-hanging pipes, and avoiding the occasional flickering light. Their footsteps echoed through the quiet, an eerie reminder that they were being hunted. The soldiers would be relentless. They turned a final corner and came face to face with a massive steel door, the entrance to the Nexus core. It was sealed tight, the symbols glowing faintly in the dark. Liora could feel the weight of the security, the cold pulse of locked secrets beyond. But this was what they had come for. If they could gain access to the core, they could uncover the full extent of the Tramadol project and, more importantly, find out how to reverse its effects. Zane stepped up to the door. "I can hack this, but it'll take time. You'll have to cover me." Liora glanced back down the hallway. The soldiers were close. The only thing standing between them and certain capture was the thick metal door. And time was quickly running out. She pulled her pulse gun from its holster, the sleek weapon glowing faintly in the dim light. She checked the ammo, plenty left for now. Then she turned to Zane. "Do it. I'll hold them off." Zane didn't hesitate. He plugged a small device into the console next to the door, his fingers flying over the holographic interface. The system resisted at first, flashing red warnings, but Zane was nothing if not resourceful. His expression was intense, lips pressed into a thin line as he fought with the machine. The seconds stretched on too long. Liora's pulse quickened. Footsteps. They were almost there. "Zane, hurry." A soft beeping filled the air as the door finally gave way, unlocking with a groan. Zane barely had time to look up before Liora fired a shot into the dark corridor. The blast ricocheted off the walls, and the soldiers dropped to the ground, temporarily stunned. "Go, go, go!" Liora shouted, grabbing Zane's arm and pulling him through the now open door. The room beyond was vast, a cavernous chamber filled with rows upon rows of sleek terminals, blinking with streams of data. In the center, a colossal supercomputer sat like a dormant beast, its heart pulsing with life, ready to reveal the secrets of Project Dreamweaver. Liora ran to the nearest terminal and began typing, her fingers moving fast, guided by instinct and years of practice. She bypassed firewalls and encrypted codes with ease, her mind sharp as she wove her way through the labyrinth of security systems. Zane, still panting from their narrow escape, hovered nearby, his eyes darting to the door every few seconds. "Do you think they're still coming?" Zane asked, his voice tight with worry. "They'll be here soon," Liora replied, not looking up from the screen. "But we have a few minutes. This system is ancient, but it's still active. I can get us the data we need." A few minutes? She wasn't sure if they had that long. Her hands shook, but not from fear. It was the adrenaline, the thrill of discovery. They were about to unlock the secrets that could change everything. Liora's eyes narrowed as a new set of files appeared on the screen. Her heart skipped a beat as she scanned through the data. There it was, the consciousness program. It was the core of the Nexus project, the program responsible for mapping and manipulating human consciousness through neural connections. Zane stepped closer. "What does it say?" Liora's voice faltered. This wasn't just about creating a dream state. They were using Tramadol to erase the boundaries between the mind and the body. They wanted to download consciousness, transfer people's memories, their souls, into artificial realities. Permanently. Zane's eyes widened in shock. "You mean, they were trying to turn people into living dreams? To keep them inside a system forever?" Liora nodded grimly. They wanted to create an entire world inside a virtual matrix, one where people would live forever in a synthetic dreamscape. But the price was their souls. And once they were inside, she trailed off. They could never escape. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she realized the true scale of what they were up against. The Dreamweaver project wasn't just an experiment. It was a weapon, a tool to control humanity itself, to trap people in a virtual prison. "We have to stop it," Zane said, his voice a low growl of determination. Liora nodded. "We will. But we can't do it alone. We need to expose this to the world. We need to make sure Tramadol and the Dreamweaver program never get out of the Nexus." Just as she finished speaking, the door behind them slammed open with a deafening crash. Shadows poured in from the hallway, tall figures in dark armor, guns drawn. Liora's heart sank. There was no more time for secrets. She turned to Zane. "We're going to need more than just data to stop them. Get ready. We're not leaving without the truth." And with that, they braced themselves for the fight ahead. Chapter 4, The Reckoning. The door to the control room slammed open with a force that rattled the walls, and Liora's pulse surged in her ears. They had seconds, maybe less, before the soldiers would flood into the room. There was no escaping through the corridors now. They were trapped. Zane moved first, his body an instinctive blur as he grabbed a nearby console and yanked it free from its mount. The heavy device made a satisfying clatter as it hit the floor, its screens flickering to life. He began typing furiously, his fingers a blur of motion as he tried to override the emergency lockdown protocols. Liora wasn't sure how much longer they had. Her breath came in short, controlled bursts as she darted around the room, seeking out any advantage she could. Her eyes swept over the terminals, their data streams showing real-time feeds of the Nexus security systems. She needed to act fast. She grabbed the pulse gun from her belt and scanned the room. There were 2 soldiers already entering, their weapons raised, their eyes locked on them. Their faces were covered by sleek helmets, the dark visors reflecting the glow of the room's neon lights. "Stop right there," one of them shouted. But Liora didn't stop. She wasn't about to be cornered, not now, not after coming so far. She aimed her pulse gun, squeezing the trigger just as the soldier fired. The blast from her gun hit him square in the chest, sending him staggering back, smoke curling from the wound. The soldier dropped to the ground with a heavy thud, his body still twitching. The second soldier hesitated, momentarily stunned by the unexpected attack, but quickly regained his footing. His eyes narrowed behind the visor. "Liora, Zane, they're coming," the soldier barked into his comlink. "We need backup now." Zane's eyes met hers, sharp and determined. He was still working on the terminal, but his movements were quick, urgent. "I need 2 more minutes. We have to hold them off." Liora didn't wait for him to finish. She darted to the side, finding cover behind a bank of equipment as another soldier charged into the room. The adrenaline coursing through her veins sharpened her focus. She wasn't thinking of the consequences now, only the fight for survival. Her mind was a whirlwind, her every instinct trained to keep moving, to stay one step ahead. The soldier fired. Liora ducked just in time, the pulse blast grazing her shoulder, the heat searing through her suit. She winced but didn't let it slow her down. She fired back, this time hitting her target in the shoulder. He stumbled back, temporarily thrown off balance. "Zane," Liora called, her voice tight with urgency. "I can't hold them off forever. Hurry." Zane's hands flew across the console, and his eyes darted between the different screens. "Almost there, almost." Another soldier stormed into the room, followed by 2 more. There was no more room to run. Liora could feel the heat of the battle pushing in from every angle. "Get to the core," Zane shouted. Liora's heart skipped a beat. The core. The supercomputer that powered the entire Nexus project. If they could reach it, they might have a chance to shut everything down. But it wasn't going to be easy. The soldiers had already begun to encircle them, their weapons aimed with deadly precision. She glanced around. There was no way to fight off this many armed soldiers without help. But there had to be something, some trick, some edge that could give them the upper hand. Her eyes locked onto the central column in the middle of the room. It was a massive, cylindrical structure, filled with glowing liquid that hummed with energy. Liora had seen the design before in the blueprints. It was part of the core's power system. "Zane, get back," she shouted before sprinting toward the column. "What?" Zane's voice was cut off by the sudden, violent noise of the soldiers opening fire. Liora dove behind the column just as a barrage of pulses hit the metal floor around her, spraying sparks in every direction. The column provided some cover, but it wouldn't last long. The soldier closest to her was distracted by Zane, who had drawn their attention with another pulse from his gun. Liora seized the moment, sliding a small explosive device from her belt. It was a prototype designed to disrupt electronic systems. With a swift motion, she slapped it against the central column and activated the timer. She barely had time to dive for cover as the timer counted down, 3 seconds. 2, 1. The explosion wasn't loud, but the shockwave that followed was enough to rattle the foundations of the entire room. The lights flickered and a deep hum echoed from the core. The soldiers' comms crackled, the interference blocking their orders. Liora knew that this was their chance. She looked at Zane. "Now." Zane didn't hesitate. He bolted for the core terminal, his fingers flying across the interface, while Liora held her position, scanning for any sign of the soldiers regrouping. She wasn't sure how much time they had, but the explosion had knocked out the soldiers' communications, giving them the opening they needed. The core terminal hummed to life. Zane had cracked it. "Got it," he shouted. "I'm accessing the shutdown sequence. We can take down the entire Nexus from here. It'll send a signal across the city, lock down the entire facility." Liora could feel the weight of his words sink in. This was it. If they could shut down the Nexus, they could stop the Dreamweaver project from ever going beyond these walls. They could save the people trapped in the dream state. But they weren't out of the woods yet. A new wave of soldiers burst into the room, flooding through the door in unison. Their armor gleamed in the dim light, and they weren't just armed with guns anymore. They were carrying energy shields, equipped to withstand everything short of a direct explosion. "We need to buy Zane more time," Liora muttered under her breath, her fingers curling around her pulse gun once more. She stood tall, leveling her weapon at the advancing soldiers. "You're not getting past me." Zane was still working, his face set in grim determination. He had to finish what he started, and she would be damned if she let them stop him now. The battle wasn't over. But neither was their fight. Chapter 5, The Final Code. The tension in the room was unbearable. Liora stood at the heart of the Nexus, her pulse pounding in time with the erratic hum of the core. The soldiers, their weapons raised and their faces obscured by dark visors, closed in around her. She had no choice but to keep moving, dodging the incoming fire with the speed and precision she had honed over years of running from the authorities. But this time it wasn't just about surviving. It was about saving what remained of the world. "Zane," she called, her voice strained. "Hurry." He didn't answer. She didn't need him to. She could see the focused look on his face as his fingers flew over the interface of the core terminal. Each keystroke was a gamble. Each second spent in the open was a second closer to death. The soldiers fired again. Liora dove behind a piece of reinforced equipment, narrowly avoiding a direct hit. Her heart raced. The smoke from the earlier blast was beginning to dissipate, revealing the soldiers closing in. They were too well trained to be taken off guard again. She pushed herself up from the floor, pulse gun in hand, and aimed for the nearest soldier. The blast hit his shield, sending a shockwave rippling outward. The soldier staggered but didn't fall. His shield absorbed the brunt of the shot. This was going to be harder than she thought. Liora turned her focus back to Zane, who was still locked in with the core's terminal. His brow was furrowed in concentration, sweat trickling down his forehead as his fingers moved faster and faster. The display in front of him flickered, the lines of code scrolling at a pace that made Liora's stomach drop. He was close. But the soldiers weren't about to wait for him to finish. One of them raised a rifle, aiming straight for Zane. "Zane, watch out," Liora yelled. Without hesitation, she launched herself toward him, just as the soldier squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, the energy blast crackling through the air. Time seemed to slow as she dove in front of Zane, taking the hit herself. The impact slammed into her side, the force of the blast sending her crashing to the floor with a gasp. Pain radiated through her body, a white-hot surge that stole her breath away. She could feel the burn of the energy weapon searing her skin, but she couldn't afford to fall. Not now. She pushed herself to her feet, barely able to stay upright, clutching her side where the blast had hit. Her pulse gun had fallen out of reach, but she wasn't done yet. Zane was already at her side, eyes wide in panic. "Liora." His voice was frantic. "You're bleeding. You need." "I'm fine," she grunted through gritted teeth. "Finish the damn code." The soldiers were closing in. They were almost within range now. Liora could barely stand, but she couldn't leave Zane alone in this. Zane's eyes flicked between her and the terminal. He hesitated for just a moment, but the urgency was clear in his expression. "I can't." "You can," she spat, steadying herself on the console with one hand. "You finish what we came here for. We're not dying here, not today. Just finish it." His face was pale with worry, but he nodded, turning back to the terminal with a renewed determination. The soldiers were almost on them. Liora could feel their presence closing in, their footsteps echoing like a countdown to the inevitable. But she couldn't let them win. Not when they were so close. She staggered toward them, struggling to stay on her feet. She wasn't done. Not yet. With a final, desperate breath, she reached into her jacket and pulled out a small, pulse-charged grenade. Her fingers were slick with blood, but she didn't hesitate. She pressed the button to activate the timer and tossed the grenade directly at the soldiers. It landed between two of them, the pulse wave expanding outward, temporarily short-circuiting their armor. The soldiers recoiled, their shields flaring with sparks, but it was enough. The shock from the grenade gave Liora and Zane a few precious moments. Zane's fingers flew over the terminal. Done. The entire Nexus trembled. A high-pitched whine filled the room as the core released a burst of energy. The shutdown sequence activated. It was only a matter of time before the system collapsed in on itself. The lights above flickered once, then twice, before plunging the room into darkness. The soldiers scrambled, shouting into their comms, but it was too late. The Nexus was unraveling. The core systems were failing, and every inch of the facility was slowly being disabled. Liora could feel the vibrations through her body, the pulse of the shutdown rippling through the air. The soldiers were panicked, trying to hold their ground, but their time was running out. "Zane," Liora gasped, her voice hoarse. "We need to go." He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the exit with whatever strength he had left. They couldn't wait. The room was caving in, systems collapsing around them, and the walls began to quake as if the very foundation of the Nexus was being torn apart. They ran, through the corridors that had once been silent, now filled with the chaos of failing systems. The hallway was starting to collapse as well, debris falling from above. Liora stumbled, but Zane was right there, supporting her every step of the way. Then, as they neared the final exit, a massive explosion rang out from behind them. The walls groaned, and a roar of fire and debris surged toward them. Liora barely managed to dive through the exit, Zane pulling her just in time. They tumbled to the ground outside, the remnants of the Nexus exploding behind them, sending a shockwave through the air. For a moment they just lay there, gasping for breath. The cold air of Oris hit their skin, and they felt the weight of the battle they had just fought, but also the undeniable relief that it was over. The city skyline gleamed far in the distance, peaceful and unaware. But for Liora and Zane, the world had changed forever. They had torn down the Nexus, the heart of the Dreamweaver project, and with it, the reality-bending experiments that could have enslaved humanity. Liora turned her head toward Zane, her voice quiet but full of gratitude. "We did it." Zane looked at her, his expression worn but resolute. He nodded, and for the first time in a long while, there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Yeah," he said softly. "We did." As the smoke from the explosion drifted up toward the sky, Liora and Zane knew they hadn't just survived. They had changed the world. The truth had been unlocked, the dream state broken, and the power of the Tramadol conspiracy erased. And somewhere, deep within the crumbling Nexus, the final echoes of the Dreamweaver program faded into oblivion.